Okay, hello everybody. Welcome to the Urban Institute. Thank you so much for joining us. We're not dismayed that you're afraid to join the first row. You can always come up later. My name is Justin Milner, and I'm a senior fellow here at the Urban Institute. I also run the Pay for Success initiative and the Evidence-Based Policymaking Collaborative. And I'm thrilled to welcome this really fantastic panel to Urban today to talk about what we think is an absolutely critical topic, which is how to think about evidence-based policymaking to ensure that government invests in what works and serves American citizens as effectively and efficiently as possible. In today's climate, there are few issues that I think are more timely and more important. I'd like to welcome everybody here today, but also welcome those who are with us over the internets. We have this webcast right now, and thank you for joining us there. Also wanted to encourage people to extend the conversation and be part of this conversation on social media. So if you whip out your phone, we will assume you're not checking sports scores, that you are actually using Twitter. And if you are doing so, you should use the hashtag #LiveAtUrban. And if possible, to include Twitter handles. I think we have some Twitter handles of people, of our panelists on the stage as well. And if you are tuning in via webcast as well, please submit questions. We'll be taking questions at the end of this event. We've got at least a half hour for questions from the audience here, but we'll also be taking questions if you email them in. That's at events@urban.org. So questions at events@urban.org. We have somebody who's going to be checking that account, and those will filter up to me over the course of the conversation. So there we go. Before we dive in, I'm going to give just a little bit of context for this conversation and then introduce the panelists, and then we'll start the conversation. So I was thinking about sort of opening comments or opening thoughts for this, and my brain kept going to like thinking about a little bit of darkness and a little bit of light. So I think we live in right now a challenging political moment. I think we can all agree with that. National politics feel about as divided as they have in some time. And it also feels like we're increasingly divided about the nature of facts themselves. That this is an era in the last year in which terms like fake news and alternative facts have become part of the common vernacular. And I think that is a scary thought for some of us researchers, those of us who are really interested in how do we use data and evidence to make decisions. And so I think that part it's a little bit of a gloomy policy environment. But into that gloomy policy environment is a bit of light, and I think the light of this in 2016, a bipartisan group, bipartisan leaders of Senator Murray of Washington and Speaker Paul Ryan started this commission on evidence-based policymaking. And the charge was really to develop a strategy for increasing the availability of federal data while protecting privacy and security, and think about how government agencies can build and use evidence. And so that just seems like an exciting and important step forward for really thinking about how do we advance to a common sense of evidence and data to really inform how we make decisions. The last month, the Commission put out its final report to Congress. It's called The Promise of Evidence-Based Policymaking. We have Catherine can model a copy of it right here. It is great reading. I really recommend it.
Nice cover, too.
It's got a lovely cover. Putting the puzzle pieces together. Sorry.
I left mine under my pillow.
Okay.
So I don't
Yes. Ron goes to sleep with it every night. And so we'll hear more about some of those recommendations shortly. And this conversation is really going to delve into, yes, what is in the Commission's report, but also the extension of that. What are the implications for federal agencies, for states, and what are some of the concrete things that we can be doing to really fill in the gaps, fill in the puzzle pieces of what that report represents? So with that, let me introduce the panel here. This is, I would say, Rockstar Group of evidence-based researchers. And we have, to my left here, Karen Abraham and Ron Haskins are the two. I'm sorry. Catherine Abraham and Ron Haskins. I'm sorry. Catherine, Kathy, 3 Ks. who were the two co-chairs of this commission. Catherine is also a professor of economics and survey methodology at the University of Maryland. Ron Haskins, 2 chairs down, is also a senior fellow in economic studies at the Brookings Institution. To my immediate left is Karen Pittman, who is the co-founder, president, and CEO of the Forum for Youth Investment. And to my far left is Kathy Stack, who is vice president for results-driven government at the Lauren John Arnold Foundation, and formerly advisor for evidence-based innovation at the White House Office of Management and Budget. So really, we have a group who are deeply steeped in these issues, and we'll be very excited to answer your questions as we get further along into the conversation. But to start, Ron, I thought I'd throw to you and just ask if you could briefly give us a sense of what the broad goals of the commission were. What were you guys charged to do?
Right. Okay, I'm glad to be here. Good audience. Thanks for coming. I hope you have good questions. So let me say that we spent the first 8 months that we were together, 15 commission members, appointed by senior Republicans and Democrats in the House and the Senate and the President of the United States. Each had 3 nominations. We had 7 meetings. Then we had 3 open hearings, one in Washington, one in Chicago, one in San Francisco. We put a notice in the Federal Register for people to send us letters. We got almost 400 letters. I think we had 40 meetings between the members and the staff with various organizations and individuals. So we really went I can't think of how we could have gone much further to try to solicit views and opinions from the public. And people who are, it's amazing how many people are really interested in data. I was especially impressed with the number of organizations that are involved with evaluation, program evaluation, who wanted to get their views across to the commission. I would say the report has 3 themes. Whenever I have something like a 100-page report that I'm trying to figure out what's in it, I always try to figure out how can I boil this down to 2 or 3 things, otherwise 4 or more, I can't remember. So 3. All right, the first one is access. Many of our recommendations are directed to increasing access to data. We can tell you a lot more about that if you want to know about it, and we have some excellent recommendations that would do that. Second is privacy. I probably shouldn't say second is privacy. Catherine had somebody count the number of times the word privacy appears in our report. 408 times the word privacy appears. And that doesn't even include transparency and all kinds of other angles on. I've been in Washington a long time, and I like to say I thought I knew a lot about privacy and how important it was and so forth, but I was a rookie. The feelings about privacy are really huge, and it has a big political punch too, because the members are concerned about it. They do not want to be associated with something that's going to raise the privacy risk for any of their programs and for any American citizens. So privacy is a very important theme. And then, of course, capacity. We have a lot of capacity in the federal government. I've always been very, very impressed with the capacity of the federal government and the agencies. They're very uneven. Some are not that great. Others are really first rate. OMB is a magnificent organization and is kind of the quarterback of evidence. But we need to build capacity in the federal government. We have several recommendations about how we could build a capacity. And they even touch on state government, which could play a way more important role than it plays now. Great. So that's a brief overview of the report and the themes in the report.
Great. And then I'm going to ask Catherine to give the almost impossible task of saying what are the 3 or 4 most important things that you'd like to call out for this audience. And it's 100 pages, 22 recommendations. What would you like to
You don't want to hear about all 22 recommendations.
As Ron said, the top 3 or 4, and then we'll forget.
Yeah, just picking up on what Ron was saying, the report talks about improving access to data, strengthening protections for privacy, and building capacity. Sort of the centerpiece of the report is a recommendation that we make for establishing something we call the National Secure Data Service. One of our specific charges was to evaluate the idea of developing a data warehouse, which we understood to mean a facility where large amounts of data would be brought in, stored, linked up, so that anyone who wanted to work with the data could come to that one place and the data would be there. We actually rejected that idea. The more we thought about it, the more concerned we became about the risks to privacy that would pose. If such a data warehouse was created, it would really be a target. So what we instead are recommending is this National Secure Data Service. And the way that we envision that working is that a researcher, who could be somebody from outside, a government analyst, a state government person, has a project that's approved that involves linking data from different parts of the government to do an analysis, that they would come to this facility, that the facility would pull in the data, create the linked data file, strip off the direct identifiers, let the researcher work with the data, complete their analysis, and then when they were done, the data would be destroyed. The linked data file would be destroyed. So that's sort of our vision of how we can increase access to data without creating unacceptable risks to privacy. We also have recommendations about either clarifying the fact that data can be used for evaluation, or in some cases changing laws to make that possible. So that's data access. On the privacy side of things, we talk about increasing the reviews that government does of data files before they're released to ensure that they're not, publicly released data aren't compromising confidentiality. We have some other recommendations in the privacy area. And then we have a set of recommendations related to increasing capacity, including a recommendation. We were very impressed by the model offered by the Department of Labor. Demetra Nightingale, who's now here, who was the Chief Evaluation Officer at the Department of Labor, and her predecessor, have just done a terrific job at the Department of Labor of developing learning agendas for the department, coordinating evaluation activities, and among other recommendations for building capacity, we recommend that as a model. I think that's 3 things. I want to say just one more thing. Yeah. So I talked about access, I talked about privacy, and one thing that I'm not sure is clear when we just talk about these recommendations individually is how integrally they are linked. We don't think that you can really increase access to data without at the same time doing the things that we're recommending to strengthen privacy protections. It wouldn't be tenable. People wouldn't go for it. So it's a package, and it would be hard to start pulling out this piece and pulling out that piece and think that the rest survives. So we're hoping that people will buy not just this piece or that piece, but our whole vision.
Can I add something really quickly?
Yeah.
Take less than a minute. Bipartisan. A very important thing in Washington that is quickly disappearing or gone. This commission was bipartisan from beginning to end. As Justin already pointed out, the Speaker and Senator Murray got together and constructed the bill. It went through both houses without a dissenting vote. They even voted a budget to it, which is also kind of an unusual thing nowadays. And the commission had strong Democrats, strong Republicans, a lot of centrists, and yet in the end, all 15 of the members agreed to all 22 recommendations, even though we had some really serious discussions. In some cases, it lasted for 2 or 3 months. So bipartisanship. And the broader point here is that if there's anything that could be bipartisan, it's a use of evidence. And I think that's why a lot of members of Congress are attracted to it. It's because it is bipartisan inherently, and it can remove the edge of partisanship from a number of issues. It will not always do it. We'll always have what Justin calls the dark, but it can play a more important role than it plays now.
Yeah. Great. So you have now a sense of what the report was aiming to do. You have a sense of what some of these critical aspects are, and we will circle back to some of those later, and happy to answer questions as well. But want to get a sense from Karen and Kathy too. When you guys read the report, and I've seen Kathy's deeply annotated version that she's had been taking on planes around the place, what your reflections were on what you thought was some of the most important things that you saw, and also if you want to highlight 1 or 2 things that you didn't see and was actually missing. Karen, can we start with you?
Sure. I mean, I think I can't emphasize enough the bold but simple sentence that said, it's just no longer the case that we can argue that we can't increase access because of privacy concerns. That simple sentence will go a long way out to states and communities in which, someone puts up the privacy word and the whole conversation stops. We can't do anything. So having a report that says it that clearly and that boldly is huge. So the three things that you talked about, access, privacy, and capacity, are all there. We were as excited as wonky people could be when we heard the commission was being put in place. And at the Forum for Youth Investment, where we've been spending a couple years with our partners at the WT Grant Foundation and the Annie Casey Foundation, really convening researchers from across the agencies just to understand how evidence was being used. We picked up quickly on the third piece, the capacity issue, and have done some extra homework to try to help you all out, to really sort of dig deeply into what kind of capacity needs to be there, what kind of capacity is currently there in all of the agencies. You raised that issue, I think, fine. The only thing I would emphasize there further is that every agency is at a different starting point. All of them have some level of capacity. The idea of actually aligning and coordinating capacity is going to be extremely important. And it's going to take some work. It is going to take coordination. It's going to take prioritization, but it's extremely important. It's important not just to be able to make more efficient the access to data. I think it's also critically important because we need to actually talk about the use of evidence more. And if I were to do anything, in reading through the report, the examples that you give really sort of emphasize the use of evidence. If you just pull out the recommendations, they're really about the production of evidence. And so in that sense, I want people to read the whole report. Please read the whole report and read the text boxes about the examples, because they're really showing you what it looks like when we actually not only have evidence that we can push out to researchers, but we can really generate demand for people really pulling up evidence out of their state and local data and matching it up with the NSDS. So that idea of just having a push and pull is there. And to do that, I think we have to, and we'll come back to this more later, we're going to have to make sure, as the report does when you read the whole thing, that we're aggressively countering, I think, what's increasingly the sort of outdated idea that the only evidence worth generating is, sort of the gold standard random control trial. As long as we have that, and that's emphasized that we have what works clearinghouses, et cetera, the incredible opportunity to really link to states and talk about the better use of administrative data, and this partnership that can happen between states and the federal government when we create this NSDS that'll just increase our capacity. We need to get that message out, that this is a huge boon towards folks who really want to figure out how to integrate administrative data and use it to answer not just what works questions, but questions about cost effectiveness, questions about program quality, questions about correlations of who goes where and what's connected to what. Those are all the kinds of things that we need to actually improve programs, not just prove what works. And this is a real benefit. So it's there. It's embedded in the report. But if I were to do a shout out, it would be let's pull that up and make it more prominent.
Great. Kathy?
So I would totally agree that the best thing about this report, it's unanimous. You've got all these commissioners essentially embracing the principle that modern technology allows us to both increase access and protect privacy, which is huge. Similar to Karen, I'm thinking about the use cases. So to me, the report, having been inside government and dealt with policy wonks and researchers, I think the report speaks to them. But I think to get this people energized about the possibilities, you've got to tell the stories that get agency heads, governors, program managers at the federal, state, and local level to see the world differently and the possibilities here, because everybody still lives in the world where they think they should hold on to their data, and why would they want to send their data to somebody else? So I would like to see, and I'd like to be helpful from the Foundation's perspective in lifting up what are those amazing, compelling use cases that make all the data owners recognize the value of having a platform where they can push their data in and get important answers that help them do their jobs better, but also help move the field. Just a quick example, one of the projects that we had supported that I think helped inform you a bit was a project that came to us from somebody who was working in the Veterans Administration, and they wanted to understand higher education outcomes for different VA higher ed programs. And we said, hey, let's think about, could we have a demonstration of how to use census, the CARA census, as a platform for bringing together data from the Veterans Administration, the National Student Clearinghouse, which is private data, but it tracks students who enroll and graduate from college, the Federal Student Aid Office, which has data on Pell Grants and student loans, Census, which has data on outcomes, looking at employment, receipt of public benefits, and bring all, and DOD, who does skills assessments for everybody who comes into the military, so you have a sense of the starting point. And we ended up basically convening all of those players, and they recognized the power of the data if they all came together, and how the old way of doing business with these one-off MOUs would make no sense at all. And if they just used the census platform, in very short time, they could begin to understand, look at correlations, tee up hypotheses about what were better programs. It was, I can't tell you how everybody in that room just got energized, like, let's do this. And then I think about the same possibilities, these pressing national crises like opioids, the opioid epidemic, where there's data sitting in insurance companies, in the Medicaid files, in the SAMHSA programs, in the treatment providers, in the criminal justice system, in the pharmacies. And our ability to get ahead of this crisis depends on figuring out how to bring that data together to answer critically important questions. And we actually have a platform now, a solution that would allow for that.
Great. So I think, so in thinking about those types of use cases, I think about this other nexus between federal data systems and state administrative data systems, and where there is and is not overlap and sharing at this point. So the report recommends that federal agencies create incentives to share this data, for states to share this data, and to potentially required in some cases. Can you guys talk about why that matters and what sort of incentives you think it will take to actually make that data sharing standard practice?
I can start.
Sure.
So first of all, I think states so often think they push data in and they never get anything back. So I think it's absolutely critical that there be a win-win, that everybody is going to learn something that's useful to them from this arrangement. Secondly, my sense is that a lot of states and localities are frustrated because they've essentially outsourced their data management to contractors. And a ton of those procurements basically make it impossible for them to get the data back themselves for their own purposes. And so I think you've provided an opening with this report to say, hey, it should be standard policy that every level of government that is benefiting from this data has a responsibility to be able to provide that data back. And that means that every procurement contract should be written so it is a requirement that the vendors provide that data at little or no cost.
I think that's a great idea, and I would second both of those points. I mean, the first thing just to emphasize is that there are states that are doing this, that already are trying to integrate data, that are partnering with their universities, that are contracting out. So this is the incentives, I think, are really focused on incentives that, one, basically say this is going to be the new norm. We've got states that have been doing it for a while. We've got folks like Dennis Colhane and others who have been really sort of putting this kind of capacity together and offering it up. But we've got the ability to say, this is where we're going. And then we can move quickly from the early adapters to the next round of folks who go, okay, now we've got an official signal that we should be going in this direction. I think the second set of incentives, and it's just back to this use cases, is really demonstrating and having these conversations about what it looks like when you do it. And the third thing I would say in this space in terms of incentives is incentives to think long term. We often think very short term, but if we're really going to do this, what does it look like 10 years out? What does it look like if you gave states incentives to really sit down and say, here's our 5-year plan or our 10-year plan of what it would look like if we actually built the capacity, We built the technology knowing that we have this NSDS there. Now we're going to basically put in place a long-term plan to pull this forward and get a little bit of competition going in that space. So I think there's a directionality to what you've done that can pull folks along. And the incentives, certainly it helps for those incentives to be monetary. I think the other thing in the incentive space is we've just done the performance partnership pilot with OMB. And that is a pilot. It's being tested right now on Opportunity Youth. But any kind of incentive that says, if you're using your data better, you can get flexibility in terms of how the money has to be pulled in and reported and used is also an incentive.
Let me add something to this. We did have a recommendation about state collected data that wasn't quite so permissive, we were aware that there's a political problem. You can't just, we didn't want to say to states, you're going to share this data, make it available to everybody and so forth, because that would cause a ruckus. But we were pretty clear about quarterly wage data, that they do, that it should be a statutory requirement is the way we formulated the recommendation. And the reason we did that, it'd be very interesting to hear what you have to say about this. I think the reason we did is because, first of all, we had a number of researchers on the commission who had a lot of experience with trying to get wage data. Yeah. And it was no fun. One talked about trying to get 50 states to agree to give the data. He had to ask every state separately. So I think we realized that especially wage data is extremely important, and especially now for evaluation studies, because we're so interested in inequality and in how to help low-income kids do better than their parents did and rise above the level that they started. And the only way to really know that is to have access to their income data. So we were really pretty clear about wage data. So that is a little different than the other data that we made recommendations about from the states.
I mean, just to pick up on that, it's really a little crazy. The federal government already has wage records submitted by the states that it stores in 2 separate locations. There's the National Directory of New Hires, where all the wage record data come in, but they can only be used at Health and Human Services for very narrow purposes. The Census Bureau has negotiated agreements with most, at this point, not quite all of the states, to have all of the wage record data, but only for very narrowly specified Census Bureau purposes. That just seems crazy. I mean, the data are coming in already, and we did think that we should figure out a way to make them available for evaluation purposes more generally.
Great. So I want to take a step back from that sort of state-federal nexus and think about this at the federal level. And Karen alluded to this, where there are agencies, departments who have very different levels of capacity, very different levels of kind of history of engagement in the sort of data sharing and the evidence building, and even different mandates, for example, non-human service agencies, for which this language may be quite new. So I'm curious as to how, and I'm looking to Catherine and Ron, but then Karen and Kathy jump in, looking for reflections on how to think about those different levels of capacity at these different agencies and how it works even with agencies as different as a VA, a HUD, and an SEC, for example.
So I'm not sure how much we have to say about the SEC, to be perfectly honest. I mean, one thing I would say about the commission, the composition of the commission, Ron emphasized how broad the expertise was and the bipartisan nature of the commission, and that's all true. It's also true that our focus was somewhat, was a social science focus. That's really what we knew about. But the issues we were asked to wrestle with were also issues where confidentiality was really important, where privacy and confidentiality were important, and it was trying to figure out a way to increase data access to that kind of sensitive data. And I'm not saying that the SEC doesn't hold data that are sensitive. They certainly do. But it's a somewhat different set of issues, though I would, perhaps the principles that we've articulated can apply there.
I think the key thing is, I think there are 2 key points here. One is there is a great difference in capacity measured by the qualifications of the people at the various agencies, their statistical capacity, their software, hardware. You know, there are just really big differences across the federal government. And the report reflects an optimism, I think, that we can improve all these. The ones that are high can get even better, and the ones that are modest can get much better, and so forth. So there's optimism that they will improve. Now, I've been on commissions before. We all know about recommendations made by blue ribbon panels, and they don't work sometimes. So I'm not overly confident that there'll suddenly be a huge burst in competence by federal agencies, but it's a good thing for the Congress to focus on. And one way it could happen is if the committees of jurisdiction bring agencies in and ask for evidence on what their programs are doing and so forth. That would really, I think that would lead to a much greater capacity in the federal agencies.
It would lead to it not being so dependent on the particular individuals that happen to be in place in particular organizations. It could become more systemic.
Kathy?
So I wanted to just make everyone realize that when Gene Grossman and then Demetra Nightingale set up the Chief Evaluation Office in Labor, Labor has all kinds of programs. They have regulatory enforcement and grant programs, and the learning agenda process applied to all of them. And I think there's huge lessons for a whole bunch of agencies that are outside the social services world.
Say a little bit about what a learning agenda is.
Okay, a learning agenda is basically a process where each major agency head has to say, what are the most important questions that if I could answer those, I could improve results in my program in some measurable way, actionable way. And at the Labor Department, the secretary and deputy secretary demanded that every assistant secretary go through the process of identifying those questions and then figuring out how they were going to get the answers. And it just so happened that they didn't have the capacity to get the answers without working with the evaluation office, which created a huge demand for the evaluation office. And not just doing traditional contracts with outside contractors, but also building a data analytics capacity internally. I think I'm just going to throw out some examples of agencies that we've been talking to that are outside the regular little circle. First, there's a set of credit agencies, small business, VA, HUD, education, where they've never had the ability to measure outcomes before. They're looking at defaults and delinquencies, and they realize that they have a responsibility to know what happens to people at the end of the day, which they can figure out if they can link their data using census. Small business. They're excited about building evaluation capacity, but how could they use linked data working with census and potentially bring researchers into government so that they don't have to do expensive contracts, or work with a network of researchers outside government where there's data that they can share because it's not personally identifiable, privacy protected. It can be public data use files. The enforcement agencies, Catherine had done this when she was inside government. She had started to build a network of regulatory enforcement agencies and then think about what are issues that are cross-cutting where networks of outside researchers could work with government folks on answering important questions that government is teeing up the questions, but they need help. And I have to say, I think there is a huge opportunity to think about lower cost, much more efficient ways of doing evaluation in the future that is less reliant on long-term contracts that take forever to go through the procurement, the PRA process, the survey, the process of collecting data through surveys, and instead think about how can we bring researchers into government or enter into partnerships with research organizations where they actually are accessing the data directly. We don't have to do surveys anymore, and we can increase the rate and the quality of the studies.
Great. So what I'm hearing is there are a lot of tools in the toolkit, and that for these agencies that may very well be in different places with different sorts of infrastructures to support it, there are still different ways to kind of plug in these tools and find partnerships both inside and outside of government. One other question to stay at the federal level. Earlier this year, the Trump administration had an executive order asking federal agencies to look at opportunities to reorganize their structures for greater efficiency. I'm just wondering, and it's okay to say no, but I'm wondering if there are any thoughts on this panel about how this work of towards the move towards evidence-based policymaking might fit into that sort of reorganization.
I'm
Kathy, you wanna
I'm
jump
happy.
in? Jump,
Sure.
jump.
So the worst thing in the world in reorganization efforts are where people are moving boxes around and you don't get any greater efficiency. So you should always ask the question first, where are the inefficiencies and how can I tackle those? So one huge inefficiency is in how government collects and manages data. You think about all the grant programs that go out to state and local governments and nonprofits where the burden is on the grantee to produce all this data, push it up through the system. It gets to the feds. They sometimes put it in spreadsheets and try to make sense of it. They sometimes put it on the shelf. Rarely do they trust it. But we still go through this process every year. And I think we have an opportunity on data to rethink what data do we really need, where does the authoritative data sit, and could we completely re-engineer how we do performance management, where we're collecting minimal data from grantees, creating intermediaries that could link participant data to outcome data held elsewhere. So that's one. Second, on evaluation, or call it evaluation, we have lots of different offices in government that are purportedly about getting better results by using information. We have the performance improvement offices that sort of report up through the GPRA structure. We have evaluation offices that have a somewhat different structure, sometimes very separate. We have the OIRA people who are developing the evaluations and sending them up through the PRA approval process. And then we have the eGov and the IT infrastructure people who are in a completely different silo. And they're all taking direction from different parts of OMB who are only loosely coordinated. So if you thought about this sort of learning agenda concept as what are the most important questions for government programs, agencies to know, and then how do we harness all these data resources and evaluation experts and organize in a way that they're actually pulling in the same direction, I think that would be huge, and it should start at OMB.
Start at OMB. Yeah, great.
And I would agree with that 100% and say that I even like the idea of putting it out there as a learning agenda question that cuts across government. The thing, and I'll sort of hold this one up, this is called Managing for Success, which we sort of did as an unofficial companion to the commission report. Because in order to do what Kathy said, we actually need to know what exists. And that's not easy. And so while the commission was doing their work, we took a year to really sort of say what exists inside of each of these agencies. What are they called? Who do they report to? What really is their official job? What are the guidebooks? What are the data protocols? How are they defining evidence? How is it being used? Are there any interagency agreements in place between 2 or 3? And so this is a huge guide to what exists, so that when we sat down to do a learning agenda, when you brought people together to do a learning agenda, it would already be footnoted what was there. And so while that process is now sort of ready to be called about and happening, it's a tremendous, we've all been in rooms too many times when, for lack of the detailed information about what really exists, we spin our wheels in sort of making grand plans. And so the contribution that we thought we could make at the forum with the WT Grant Foundation was actually just to dig in and say what actually is there. The other thing that's there that helps us not reinvent the wheel is literally what's there in terms of if you wrote guidelines, what's the text? So that the next agency that wants to write guidelines can look at your book and go, oh, we already did that. The Department of Labor did a great job over here. Let's see what it looks like, see if we can adapt it. So that opportunity to really improve efficiency inside of each agency by learning where something has already happened in another agency that could be adapted is really important, and we hope to be able to speed that process up.
Great.
I'd like to add just one quick thing. Anybody who's been in Washington 15 minutes knows OMB is super important. And if you read our report and recommendations, you can see that we saw OMB as kind of the quarterback of the evidence-based movement, and we specifically mentioned many things that have to do with management that we thought OMB should be empowered to do. So, and we actually had a chance to meet with the head of OMB, Mr. Mulvaney, and he seemed to be very receptive. But without OMB, it'll be much harder to act on several of our recommendations.
Okay. Great, thank you. And just to note, for the report that Karen referenced, we're going to send that out as part of a follow-up email, so you guys will get a link to that. You should definitely check that out. Karen, want to go back too. So we've been hanging out at this federal level, want to zoom in and really think at the local level, and think if you can kind of translate for us, or really think about how these recommendations, which really are, have been more federally focused, and thinking about OMB, thinking about agencies. What does this mean for the sort of broader ecosystem of nonprofits, service providers? How does this either trickle down or directly impact their work?
I think what you're trickling down is hope. And hope, because right now what you have, especially at the local level, certainly at the state level, but if you're at the local level and you're asking one of these important questions, we want to know whether X is connected to Y. We think disproportionately in this neighborhood or this community or this county, this is happening. You're really at a loss as to how to find that data. You're at a loss as to who to even ask for that data. You often end up sort of doing that study on your own expense or getting foundation dollars to do that study. The idea that there actually is, even if you can't access it directly, the idea that you could go to your university, find a researcher, pose an important question, and say to that researcher, you can get the data to be able to help us answer this question. If I go to our local agencies and get this, you can go get the data that matches, you can follow folks across the county. There are so many things that you could do. We have to get that information out there. But again, I think it really is like the performance partnerships. There's a different way of thinking that will take a little bit of while to take hold, but once it does, we really have left communities on their own to answer important questions, which for the most part are correlational questions, not what works questions. They've already got a bunch of stuff that's already in place. It's nice to know that there's, a program above that worked perfectly and they could bring it into their communities, but they also just have much more basic questions that they're trying to ask, and important questions, so that they know where to put programs, where things are working. Things like families that are involved in multiple systems. That's a huge question. It's a huge expense. How do these families move back and forth between these systems? We're talking about crossover youth going between child welfare and juvenile justice. All of these are questions where if you've got administrative data, and you've got the signal that says even that basic conversation about privacy does not have to be the thing that stops us from asking this question. So I think what you're doing in some ways is giving communities permission to create learning agendas and say, we think you can actually help us answer this question, and then hold up this nice report and say, it says it in here that you can do it.
That's great.
Can I just add, so, a lot of states have integrated data systems of some form. A lot of them are built on the state longitudinal data systems that exist for education. But there's always going to be other data sets that sit outside of that. And there's a project that we supported at the foundation, which I think is essentially similar to what the National Student or the National Secure Data Service is, which is a platform. It's called the Administrative Data Research ADR Facility, which right now it's being tested with a number of states and cities, and in fact the state of Illinois has decided they're going to take it and run with it. But it allows you to take different state and local data sets and put them in the cloud and do this kind of data linkage in a secure and privacy protected way. And that platform can also now link up to census data. So I think it's almost like a parallel structure that exists. We have a prototype for the state and local level, which nonprofit data could also be part of. And you marry that up with what the NSDS would be, and you can have a national system.
Great. So let's talk a little bit more about what that can look like. Catherine, this idea of a national secure data service really underpins a lot of the report, and that this is the place where this sort of temporary linkages would take place. Can you talk a little bit more about the advantages and the limitations of that approach and how it actually play out?
Sure. So there's a lot of things that would have to be thought through in order to make this work well. As I mentioned before, the reason that that's where we came out in terms of our recommendation is that we didn't want to build a big data warehouse with everything sitting in one place that would be a magnet for hackers. But there's also, it does introduce some frictions into the system. What it means is if there's, somebody else has done a study and you want to come back and replicate it, the data aren't going to be sitting there for you to do that. We did think about this. In order to make this work, we would want the National Secure Data Service to preserve all of the code that linked the data together so that if somebody else came in and wanted to replicate the study, they could do that. The National Secure Data Service isn't going to be holding the underlying data that were linked. They're going to be back in wherever they came from, so that there's going to need to be people in the agencies that were supplying the data who are paying attention to data and data resources, and one of their responsibilities would be archiving data sets that were submitted to the National Secure Data Service for various projects. So, we think that this is a good model because it can give people who want to do research, want to do evaluations, want to do analysis, access to data that they wouldn't otherwise have. But in order to ensure that you have the replicability, the reproducibility that's an important part of the scientific, the evaluation enterprise, you need to think through how that's going to work.
Cool. Can we do a quick role play? Let's pretend I'm Raj Chetty, like I suddenly became 10 times more brilliant than I currently am. And I'm looking to do another sort of cross-cutting data research project and really look at these things. How is this system going to work differently from what currently exists now?
Well, for some of what Raj has done, things aren't going to change. For a lot of what he's been doing, he's been working with tax data. So he's not linking data that come from multiple parts of the government. He's working with tax data, and if the Statistics of Income Division has a process in place for allowing outside researchers to come in and work with data, he can keep doing that. If he's interested in linking IRS data to data from some other agency, this would facilitate that.
So it potentially opens up the kind of outcomes that you can look at as a researcher.
So I should say, Raj Chetty may not be the best example. Okay. And let me explain why I say that. The reason I say that is that he has been super good at going out and negotiating arrangements and getting access to data. He's just really, really good at that. But he's kind of a unique case.
The outlier.
The people I think this will help more are the researchers who aren't quite as good at doing that as Raj.
More Raj Chettys.
More Raj Chettys. That's a good way to put it.
And can I ask it from another perspective? So if I'm federal executive, I'm in charge of my agency's performance management agenda, are there going to be ways to use the NSDS to get information about performance of programs? So really kind of stepping aside from just the evaluation space, but also thinking about the sort of performance space.
You may want to take
Yeah,
that.
I want to make a more general point that this fits into it. I don't think there's any place in the report where we specifically talk about the National Secure Data Service and performance data. And that raises a point. Once you create this thing, what it could do and its capacity and what data it can get access to and how they can facilitate access by researchers around the country remains to be determined. So if it turns out to be a terrific agency with terrific leadership, it could, yes, it could do performance. They can do almost anything you can think of. The limit is going to be the imagination of the people who want to use the secure data service. So I think how it's implemented and how quickly they can get up to something really extraordinary, the potential is there to create huge capacities that we've never had before, and we can get very sophisticated new analyses, both to describe the state of the world and as outcomes for evaluation studies, which I think is the single most important thing.
Great, great. So we're going to open this up to questions from the audience in a minute, and online, again, it's events@urban.org if you want to ask questions. We have somebody monitoring that account. So I'm going to ask this question to the group, and then I'll turn over to the audience. But so at a high level here, I sort of mentioned at the outset, I talked a little bit about the dark, the light. I don't know if it's too dramatic, but this is an era, I think, in which we have leadership that is sometimes contesting facts and news, and that traditional referees like the Congressional Budget Office have been a bit under attack. And I'm curious on your reflections of how, if the recommendations of this commission were really truly implemented, like how can they help us navigate this, these political waters right now? How does this help us, get through
I think the most important thing is that this commission, bipartisan, passed unanimously by the Congress, 15 diverse members of the commission, unanimous recommendations. It greatly elevated the idea that evidence-based policy is really important, and it's something that all of Washington is united behind. Now, that does not mean that they're going to be implemented in an ideal way. We're always going to have this fight between light and darkness. Some of you probably have read about that the Department of Treasury, I think it was, that recently removed a very nice study from its website because it doesn't agree with one of the policies that they want to push. And that is always going to happen. I was in the House for 14 years and in the White House for a year, and people who have a clear goal, they're willing to cut corners. And it varies from agency to agency. It varies from time to time. It varies between the political parties at various times. So we're always going to face that. But this is a vote for doing it right, for making the data available, for having clear procedures, and for giving access to people so they can do things that would be of help to states and to the country as a whole. So I think that's the single most important thing. We clearly come down on the side of do it right, use data, figure out what's actually happening, and use that to make decisions.
Sort of picking up on that, one of the things that we really emphasized in the report is transparency. Transparency in terms of the uses that people are making of data, transparency in terms of if a study is done and generates a set of results, getting those results out there and not sitting on them or taking them off the website or whatever, which honestly I've seen happen in administrations of both parties. I think that's a really important part of what we were trying to say. Is it's not that evidence is going to determine the decisions that get made, but you want to have evidence out there to inform those decisions.
Yeah, and I would argue that just, if this can be put in place, the increase in access to a variety of evidence that can be used for a variety of purposes allows us, doesn't guarantee it, but it allows us to honestly have conversations about budget neutral changes. So that if we can in any way move from, the hatchet falls when the evaluation happens and it's all or nothing for a program, to being able to say, look, we have administrative data, you can track people afterwards, you can make these connections, you can take your data and add on data on the other side to see if people change counties. We need to be able to say, we want this program to improve, but we want to turn it back to you. Rather than just cutting the program, can we turn it back to you and have you create the agenda that says, how are you going to make this program improve? Are you shifting, or this program clearly isn't working, can we go over here and look for one that does? So again, that's a political conversation that we don't control, but at least we can say, stand up and say, we could do that. We have, the system in place that would allow us in a coordinated way to use administrative data to actually talk about improvement rather than just talking about yes or no to programs.
All right, since everybody else chimed in, I guess I have to say my 2 cents. I would hope that the existence of this and starting a sort of a new cycle where people recognize, things that we never thought we can actually answer now. And that feeds back into how we design programs. We have so many pieces of legislation that were the best of intentions by people who sort of follow the cookie cutter template of here's a problem, here's a solution, here are the actors who can play, and here's the activities that they can carry out. And when those laws were passed, there was no way to know whether or not they were really achieving those objectives. We're in a new era. We can figure that out within a few years for a lot of things. And so I think it allows for people to be a little more humble and think about program designs that recognize you're going to get those feedback loops, and you better build into them the ability to adjust.
Fantastic. Great. Thank you for those thoughts. Let's take a pause and let's look at see the audience. If we have any questions, we have roving mics, so please wait until the mic is in your hand. Sir, in the way back.
Sure. Thank you very much. It's important what we're hearing here today with respect to having increased access.
Can you speak up a little bit or speak into
Yes,
the mic?
with respect to. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Great. With respect to increased access to data, there's also the question of data quality. So have you in the commission report or in your efforts found solutions for which agencies can be transparent about the degree of uncertainty in the data? For example, some administrative data that may have latent errors or misreporting. And then you can also have data entry issues, assembly of the databases, those types of things. And feels as if, to me, it would be useful for researchers external to government to be able to see and have transparency into not only the applications of the data, but also the limitations with respect to uncertainty in the data quality.
Great. Thank you. So question around data.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I would say two things about that. One of the things that we do recommend is the creation of a data inventory that contains metadata about the data, that provides information about what the agency at least knows about what it has. But the other, and probably the more important thing I would say, is that I think bringing researchers in to work with data is probably the best single thing you can do to improve the quality of the data. The Census Bureau actually has a long history of this. They've, for years now, been bringing in external researchers to work with data at the research data centers, the administrative data that underlie the business register and so on. And they've found all kinds of issues with the data that it was then possible, once the issue had been identified, for the Census Bureau to fix. And I do think that once you have people working with these data rather than them just sitting in some file somewhere not really being looked at, that will be a positive force for improving data quality.
You want to be sure, though, if you're a researcher, that you get someone else to do it first and find all the problems with the data and get them fixed. Then you come along and you can do it much better.
Good solution there. Yes, sir.
My thanks to the panel. It's really been very encouraging, even in the atmosphere of darkness and light. And unfortunately, maybe I'm pulling us back to one side or the other. You tell me. I struggle with criminal justice policy concerns, things like the uniformity or consistent complements of state and federal data, a public understanding that sometimes good data needs at least a minimum of 2 years of being handled and evaluated. These are things that, again, questions of privacy have been historically used as stoppers. So here's the things I'm wondering about. What's the role of public engagement? How does this move beyond the elites of bureaucracy and stakeholders who are official handlers? Again, you've been very clever, and rightly so, that political decisions around data are not left to researchers, but I'd like to hear more about this. Thank you.
That's a great question, and I think the report really, you guys do a nice job.
There are at least
talking
two
about
places,
this.
there
Yeah.
may be more, and you'll
Yeah.
correct me if I'm mistaken here, that we recommend explicitly that the public be involved in some kind of oversight role. We do it with the National Secure Data Service, and we mention it at least one other place when we give a charge to individual agencies that they also have to have input from the public. So as the commission was well aware that the public, we serve the public, the government serves the public, they ought to be involved at a high level here so they can, so that they can give their input. And the other thing is, privacy is such an important issue for many reasons, but not the least is that you need to develop trust in government. You need people to know that if they give information to the government, to the Census Bureau or whoever it is, that it is secure. They take good care of it. They don't have data releases. So these are really important considerations. The public role is very important.
Just another real-life example. So the whole learning agenda process and engagement on that, at the local level, which is often where you're going to be a lot closer to people. I don't know if you followed the lab at DC, but it's a project that we're funding. And they are a bunch of PhD researchers who work in the city administrator's office and help develop research questions with agencies about, you know, how can we improve something, whether it's rat control or the workforce training programs. But they have, as part of their process, public engagement. They're out there making sure that they're asking the right questions and talking about how any kind of experiments are going to be designed and getting input from local citizens. And I think it's critical.
Great. Question? Yeah.
Hi, I'm Jeremy from Results for America. First of all, can I say just humorously, Kathy, I love that the first example you give is rat control versus workforce programs. It illustrates nicely the difference sometimes between questions that citizens probably want answered and questions that researchers want answered. But my question is about, I'm not going to make a joke about also rats, but about Congress. So how could Congress be a better partner and supporter to some of the recommendations that the commission made? And it triggered for me, Ron, when you said, wouldn't it be great if every committee and Congress that has oversight of some of the agencies just asks them for an update that year of what evidence they have for the programs that maybe they're making budget decisions about or writing legislation about. And it made me think about the learning agendas. Like, those aren't just for the agencies themselves, right? Some of them we have in the education law, a requirement that they're basically their research and learning agenda at Ed is submitted to Congress. So it's a long way of saying, in addition to the recommendations you make, how could Congress be sort of a better supporter and partner to help execute some of the recommendations that you all made in the report?
I think in the last, I'm going to say decade, I'm not sure exactly what period of time, that Congress has given many indications that it really and is truly interested in evidence-based policy. If you go back to the Obama initiatives, the tiered initiatives, especially home visiting and teen pregnancy prevention, and you look in enacting legislation, Congress actually specifies the outcomes that they want measured. And they tell the agency how they have to do this. They can do it with private contracts and so forth. But, I mean, that is really a very sophisticated approach that we want to know if this program is working, and we won't know unless you measure these variables. And they even put the term in there, using random assignment where possible. So, and then pay for success is another thing that's mentioned now in 5 or 6 different pieces of legislation. So I don't think there's any question that we've got more attention in Congress than we've had in the past. Now, as to process, that Congress will really use this information, there I think that I'm more doubtful. The way Congress has used so far the teen pregnancy prevention, at least on the House side, to me is very discouraging. Because the administration, first of all, the administration preempted the Congress and cut the programs with no warning. Sent them a letter. At the end of this year, the money's gone because they say the result didn't work. Well, that is a question subject to clear study and examination and testimony from all different sides. The way I think of it, the teen pregnancy prevention series of 41 programs, all of which had high quality evaluations. I don't think anything even close to that has ever happened before. And about 40% of the programs, depending on how you measure them, produced at least one significant impact on an important outcome of sexual behavior or teen pregnancy. So to me, that's way better than in the past. And Congress doesn't know that because they didn't have hearings. My point is, Congress has to be relentless in using the data and showing agencies, we want to know the outcomes. Come before us and tell us not just what you did with the money, but was it successful? If we don't reach that point, we're going to be minimally successful, and we can have 50 more commissions, and it won't have the impact it should have.
It is the back. Hi, my name's Hannah Sheets-Freimiller, and I have the pleasure of working for an evidence-based agency that was founded to use evidence in our policy, the Millennium Challenge Corporation, at a different era of evidence-based policymaking. And it's really encouraging to hear about the progress that you're making. And we think about these issues a lot in our work. So your talk brought up two big questions for me. And the first is, any data system is only as good as the question that it is designed to answer. So you spoke about OMB as the quarterback. So I'm curious about what the Commission thinks is the big question that a national data system would be geared to answer for, whether it's OMB as the quarterback or it's local and state policymakers. Because I could see that being different and very hard to design something that would work for everyone. The second question is, we are often asked by Congress about our outcomes, and as someone who's a steward of those outcomes, it's rarely on the timeline around which the political policymakers want to make a decision. And as more evidence gets out there, more and more policymakers are going to be facing that pressure, more data, more evidence, but oftentimes that timeline doesn't align with the decision. So I'm curious on whether that was considered and what your guidance would be as people wade into this space. How do they balance those pressures?
Let me try to answer at least the first of your questions. And I guess I would answer it by saying we were not thinking of this the way that you were. We were not thinking of this as designing a data system to answer a specific question or set of questions. Rather, we were thinking of this as designing an approach to make data more accessible so that the people who have questions that are important to answer can come in and have a way to get them answered. So we were looking at it a little differently. We're seeing this data service as being something that's very flexible, that is a place where someone who comes in with a novel idea that involves linking data that hadn't previously been linked could arrange for that to happen and address their questions. So it's maybe a little, it's different than building a data system in the way I think you were thinking about it. I mean, that's not to say that as people develop this idea, they're not going to have to think about the kinds of questions that people are likely to ask and the expertise that they need to have in-house in order to get the right data linked and so on, but it's a little bit different. I don't know how to respond to your question about the timeline of evidence generation being different than the timeline for decision making. I don't think that's going to go away, but I do think that if we develop a culture in which evidence is being generated on an ongoing basis about programs that we're spending significant amounts of money on, at whatever point in time someone has a decision they have to make, it will be better informed. That's the hope.
I think the biggest problem with timelines is that I think we've learned now, and we've actually known this longer than you might think, and haven't faced up to it, very few of our programs work. And even when they do work, when you try to replicate them somewhere else, they don't work. So it is going to take a long time to develop programs that can be generalized and implemented in other settings. And I'll bet you, as we learn about this, we're going to find you have to make adjustments. It isn't just faithfully replicating the original program. You're going to have to make adjustments depending on where they're implemented. So that timeline is not very compatible with a policymaker who's looking for a way to cut programs, of which we have many in this administration. And that's always going to be a danger. It is always going to be a danger. But if we're really committed, and if the policymakers up on the Hill are committed, they're going to have to be patient. We're going to have to develop these programs over a period of years, or we're not going to get results. And here's the irony. They don't have any idea about this because we've never had good evaluations before. They don't know how hard it is to get a program that works in one place, let alone to get it to work in 50 or 1,000 places. We have 1,600 Head Start centers. 1,600. We want a program to educate preschool kids that's going to be implemented 1,600 places. That's going to be extremely difficult to do. Patience is very important.
Yeah, but I would add to that, and the question about how do you sort of get community engagement in this. If we begin to move down this road, you have to change the assumption. You have to change the question. You have to change the expectation of have we implemented a program that works everywhere for everybody, to if we've done something right, we probably have a program in place that's doing something for somebody. And how do you then understand who those somebodies are, what that something is, where that seems to be happening the most, and then you're coming into administrative data to say, well, and what else is going on in their lives? What else are they participating in? Is it working best for the young people? Is this Head Start working best in this kind of community? Is it working best for these kind of? So that's what we have to be doing. We have to start with the assumption, as you said, these things are not perfect. But if we start with it that it's not perfect and what we're doing is a series of less than perfect replications that we have to look at, we're going to continue to go down that path. We have an opportunity now, and that's why I'm saying it's so important for us to have this dialogue about what this allows us to do is shift the conversation to what works well for whom, where, and why, from did it work or did it not work.
Great. Any other questions? Yes, Sandy. Oh, can you wait for a microphone?
Oh, sorry. Speak so loudly, I just figure everybody can hear me. Sandy Davis, Bipartisan Policy Center. This is a great discussion, and it's been very interesting to hear the discussion about the demand side of the equation. How do we get policymakers to actually use and understand the value of this, the available data, improved techniques, how much is out there, and the great work of the commission and sort of making it more accessible and improving privacy. And I'm thinking about Jeremy's great question about, how do we get Congress to be more supportive of the use of evidence and evidence-based policymaking, and make sure it has a seat at the table. But communication is a two-way street, and I keep wondering, back to the issue of data trust that Kathy raised in particular. Thinking about members of Congress and policymakers generally, they are inundated with data. They're inundated with information. They have incredibly busy schedules. They are just overwhelmed. How can researchers, how can the research community, folks who generate the data, use the data, understand the data, do a better job of communicating its value to policymakers where they are? How can the research and policy collaboration work in that direction to work more effectively, to embed it in the legislative process and the policy-making process? I mean, I think there are good models at the state level. Some of the states have done a really good job of this. I think of Washington State, Utah, New Mexico, of sort of embedding it in their routine process, the use of evaluations and data. I'd love to hear your thoughts, any or all of you guys, because you've thought a lot about this, I know, about how the communication can work more effectively in the other direction, to build trust in the data, to help policymakers understand its value in the regular policymaking process on an ongoing basis. That's just a small question.
To jump in.
So I thought that was what the Congressional Budget Office did.
Well, that's a very good point.
In part.
That's my experience.
I think at the time that the CBO was set up, that was partly what the Congress had in mind, and it seems to me to have functioned in general.
That's a really good example. I think that, for example, do you need a third party? Do you need somebody to help translate the research? Maybe understand and, what are the
Library of Congress
of it? Yeah, is that needed for an evidence function as well?
The Congressional Research Service.
Yeah.
So I'm going to pick up on your point about states. I think a lot of people know about Washington and WSIP, Washington State
Institute
for Public Policy. There are some other things that the Arnold Foundation they're supporting, which I think are an interesting model. We have something called policy labs, where maybe the best example is Rhode Island, where it is a partnership between Brown University, the governor, and the agency heads, where the government is essentially saying, here are the questions that I need to have answered. And the government has provided 200 high-value data sets to Brown, who's created an integrated data system for about $1 million. But that investment in that infrastructure now allows researchers at Brown to be working hand in hand with government to answer their questions. And it's not, sometimes it's a long-term study, but sometimes it's quick turnaround. Here's what we know based on the data that we have, and we can work with you on how to set up trials. And then the legislature gets brought into that. So it essentially creates a dialogue around what are the important questions, what are the most efficient ways of answering them with content experts and research experts. And we don't have that at the federal level. We really don't, and we could learn something from the states.
I agree.
Want to think about for this group, as we start to think about how these recommendations are actually implemented, two things that I'm curious about. One, there's not a ton of mention in the report around how these things might be funded. Yeah. Any reflections? I know it's putting you on the spot a little bit, but any reflections on where to draw from either existing resources within agencies or possibilities of how you get this done?
We should both weigh in on this. We had a number of discussions about money, and this is another area where I think there were great political sensitivity by the members of the commission. If we came out with something that was bold and would cost billions of dollars, it wouldn't get anywhere in this environment. So we deliberately didn't talk too much about money. We did suggest things at several places in the report that you could do for modest resources. One of the best examples, the Department of Labor has a set aside for program evaluation from their budget. And that's revenue neutral, and it's, at least in our view, it's a better use of the money. And if you set aside 0.5% or something like that. At some point, though, for the National Security Data Service, another example, because we want to set it up within the Department of Commerce, the kind of things that Census Bureau now does now are directly pertinent, and a lot of the people there could work on this. Hopefully the Census Bureau will play a big role in the beginning, but in the long run, if you're going to have a really effective national data service, it is going to take more resources, and we leave that to other people to worry about.
Right. Yeah. We did, the one thing we did say was that the National Secure Data Service should have the ability to accept funds to support its activity from other agencies of government, and other agencies of government should have the authority to provide those funds so that there would be a channel for resources. Right. I think the best idea that we came up with was some sort of a set aside that would be for supporting evaluation purposes. It does seem to me that if you're operating a program, a part of operating the program is on an ongoing basis looking at whether it's working or not, and if it's not working, who it's working for, who it's not working for. Yeah. And that spending some of your program funds on ongoing evaluation would be perfectly appropriate, and as Ron said, a better use of the money.
And I would think, staying with the set-aside idea, which is, obviously one of the safer ways to go, it may be important to distinguish between set-asides for the evaluation of a specific program and an even smaller set-aside for the capacity of the agency to be able to put the infrastructure in place that allows it to do this across programs.
Yeah.
But an impressive thing about what happened at the Department of Labor with Demetra Nightingale is they didn't get any act of Congress. They didn't either get new money or new authority. They just did it. And I think part of it was because of Demetra, but it goes back before that. I wrote about this a little bit in my book, that the Department of Labor was really interested in being able to evaluate their programs. And they hired a contractor using their regular budget money, not a contractor, but a temporary employee from Princeton to be able to do that. And then along came Demetra, and she had this idea about chief evaluation officer. So it's two things. It's the agency realizing how important it is to be able to do this sort of thing, to evaluate their programs, and being willing to have the flexibility to allow someone like Demetra, who has a ton of experience and knew what she was doing, and the respect of people in the various sub-departments there at Labor, to go ahead and set something up. So it was initiative. without very much resources that made a very big difference, I think. And suddenly, several other agencies, she wrote us a letter, by the way. She testified for the commission. We asked her to write a letter about her experience with the, being a chief evaluation officer. And 4 other agencies joined her and signed the letter and said, yeah, this is what we ought to be doing. And they're trying to do the same thing.
So I just want to add experiences during the Bush administration when we had top lines, right, that you had to figure out how to live within a top line, but you wanted to do new stuff. And it forced some really, really good conversations. One example that could be pertinent here was back at the beginning of No Child Left Behind. The Bush administration said we should be caring about student outcomes, and yet their processes for collecting information from dozens of K-12 programs was self-reported process information with no information about outcomes. And there was a recognition that they needed to completely transform working with state and local governments, what things were measured and how they got reported in a simple electronic way. Well, guess what? There were 100 vacant FTE at the time, at the beginning of the Bush administration. And if they had filled all of those, it meant the cost of building this infrastructure for new reporting would be on top of that. But the alternative was to say, most of those FTE are in programs that are collecting garbage data, trying to pretend that they're managing the program, and they're not. Why don't we take that money, $10 million, and build the infrastructure that really became the national data infrastructure for the state longitudinal data systems? So I use that as an example. Another example, I think, is that a lot of our evaluation activity in a lot of agencies is still more costly than it needs to be because we're under this old model of how we procure with expensive contracts and do surveys. There's a whole different strategy for building out a learning agenda and doing lower cost studies now, where I'm totally on board with set-asides. I think that's absolutely the way to go. But I think we have to recognize what's the most efficient way now to get this information.
Yeah, fantastic. So a few ways to get there. For just a closing thought, Ron, I was hoping you could give us a sense of the timeline going forward in terms of, you guys are kind of in the roadshow stage of talking about and publicizing the report right now. What do things look like over the next year?
We have managed, or I guess I should say Arnold's had managed to put aside some money and to give it to the Bipartisan Policy Center to kind of fill the role of getting the word out. And I hope, and I think this is really the most important answer to your question, we need legislation to implement many of our recommendations, especially the secure data service. So fortunately, the Speaker has already put the word out that he wanted legislation. The appropriate committee in the House and the Senate are working on legislation. They have drafts of legislation. I prefer not to talk too much about it because they're going to have a markup pretty soon. It's not all of our recommendations, but it's a set of recommendations because the Speaker, and I think Murray agreed with this, they want to show momentum. They'd like to pass it this year. So I'm virtually positive the legislation will be written, it'll be publicized, they'll mark it up, and I think it'll pass. I hope it passes. And that's a real important role that we need to play. And we will do everything we can to support the legislation. And then above all, next year, to have a bill that goes even further, especially with the National Secure Data Service, and establishes that, which I think is the heart of our report, and then to support that bill. So that's quite an undertaking.
Great.
Get out the word and then support the legislation.
Great. Well, so that's something everybody in this evidence space, stay tuned for this. Definitely pay attention for the legislation that's coming up. But join me in thanking this fantastic panel for this great conversation. And thank you to Catherine and Ron in particular just for their great public service that they've done in leading this commission. It really is a remarkable report, and I think those of us who really care about these issues, it is a guidebook and a blueprint for us to move forward. So thank you guys.
Thank you.
Great.
Yep, thank
okay,
you.
Thank you all.